Hello, welcome to this episode of the Bible Toolbox, where we help you enjoy the Bible through the tools that scholars and programmers have created for you. I am Luke Kieser,
And I'm Chris Gow.
and this is part of our series, Walking Book by Book, and reviewing the Bible Project video on that book. So here's our first one on the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so here is an outline of the the Gospel of Matthew according to the Bible Project. So, I mean, their presentation of it is way more attractive, with their
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
cartoons and stuff. But really, all that it is an outline of the book. And so their basic structure here, they say that the book of Matthew, the thesis of it is that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's story as the Messiah, that's of David, the new Moses, and Emmanuel, which is God with us. That's their that's what they think. The Gospel of Matthew is all about this. Jesus as the fulfillment of God's story is Messiah, new Moses, and Emmanuel. And then they break the Gospel of Matthew into three main parts: the introduction, the middle part, and then the climax. So the introduction being the genealogy, the birth, the baptism of Jesus, the climax being the crucifixion, resurrection, commission. And then in the middle, they they say that there is a five-part structure that has narrative for a chapter or so, and then has a discourse. And then I've listed out the chapters there that they noted.
So yeah,
And
within each part, you get a narrative and a discourse, some
right,
stories, and then teaching from Jesus in each of the five parts.
yeah, and they make the claim that this is um, reflecting the five books of Moses. Not that like they're not making the claim that like the first part is Genesis, the second part is Exodus, but just like the general idea of Matthew is setting up Jesus as a new Moses, and this five parts kind of reflects that.
Hmm.
And you see it especially like at the beginning of Matthew with Jesus goes to Egypt. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. He's tempted in the wilderness. He goes into the wilderness for 40
Hmm.
days instead of 40 years. And then he goes to the mountain and he gives the new law or the Sermon
Yeah.
on the Mount. So
Yeah.
like it seems to be mapping Moses's life.
And even in the Sermon on the Mount, right, it's like you've heard that it was said, and he's citing Moses and then giving
Yes.
his new interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah. So um so this is a common structure. They're not just pulling this out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's very common to break Matthew up into these five parts. An alternative structure that I found is by R.T. France. This is in the Tyndale New Testament commentary series. And France says that there's broadly two outlines in Matthew's scholarship. One is the five-part one that we saw, the Bible Project. But France actually prefers what he calls the Markan outline. He agrees that there are five discourses. And the evidence here, I've listed out the verses, is that five times in the Gospel of Matthew, it has this phrase of like, and when Jesus finished these sayings, and when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, and when Jesus had finished these parables, and when Jesus had finished these sayings, when Jesus had finished all of these sayings, like it's repeating that.
And
Um,
then each of those texts come right at the end of the major discourses.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
A major discourse that Jesus is teaching
Hmm.
to someone. Um, so France says that seems legit. It seems like there are five discourses in the Gospel of Matthew. What he disagrees with is that there's like this intentional, like five parts. Like there's narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse, narrative, discourse. He more says like the narrative is just following the narrative structure of Mark. It's just following Mark from, his Galilee ministry to, his uh, going down to Jerusalem and then his time in Jerusalem. Uh, So Matthew's just following that same structure, but on the way, he's inserted these five discourses of
Hmm.
Jesus at relevant parts. It's not as if they're random, but they fit into the timeline, the narrative that we see in Mark.
Like the example you were giving of in the Sermon on the Mount, this is sort of Jesus's coming out party as a teacher. It's going to come early. He's
Yep.
sort of laying out his manifesto in the Sermon on the Mount. So that comes early at the start of his ministry. Or then like the later discourses, we have the parables about the kingdom that talk. Some of them are rejection kind of parables, so they come towards the end, towards the
Yeah.
crucifixion scene. So
Well,
the theory is
yeah.
that
And especially like the last discourse is during his time um, in Jerusalem when he's
Mhm.
like facing the scribes and Pharisees and he's like telling them about the destruction of the temple and
Yeah.
the end times. Um,
So the theory would be that that Mark collected groups of sayings and put them together where they fit in the narrative, in the chronology.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So some tensions I want to point out with the Bible Project outline. And one of my favorite here is in the fourth one. Notice how they say that the discourse is 18, 19 to 20. And you're
Hmm.
like, well, why didn't he just say 18 to 20? Right? And it's because 19:1 says, now when Jesus had finished these sayings. So I don't know. Well, like, so 19 and 20 is teachings of Jesus. And so I think, like, content wise, it's still kind of a discourse. And that's why um, Mackie kept it here in the discourse. And it is about kingdom teachings. But in terms of like explicit markings and structure,
Hmm.
Matthew ended his discourse at 18.
Yeah.
You
Which is
know,
a real tension if you're trying to organize the whole book based on these explicit textual markers that are
right.
supposed to mark off the discourses. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like a huge deal, but
Hmm.
it is like and Tim Mackey knows it obviously because
Sure.
he separated it.
Mhm. Right.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah. In
Um,
general, I think one of the differences between the two outlines reflect decisions that all New Testament scholars have to make when they make outlines like this. Do you privilege these explicit textual markers, or do you privilege themes? How much do you make of like repeated words? And this is an example where the Bible Project has chosen to use the repeated words of Matthew as a kind of um, bookmarking feature. This is how the structure is outlined by the scribe who wrote it. But one of the tensions is if you find one problem with how the textual marker fits in relation to the theme, it can problematize the whole outline. So that's a great example where maybe you're better off choosing a theme to make your clusters and your chapters rather than the textual marker because one counterpoint, one counterexample on the textual marker piece can problematize the outline.
mhm. Yeah. And that's it. Like there's multiple things that are happening in a book, and
Hmm.
it's hard to make them all fit into one outline.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that's just yeah, what you privilege will
Hmm.
determine what outline you run with. And often they're all like noting something true, and so they're helpful in that way. But
Yeah.
yeah, it can be hard to balance.
Hmm.
Um, another tension that I saw here. So they put their fifth section as Clash of Kingdoms, which this is 21-22 is them debating, arguing with the Pharisees and Sadducees. And then the discourse they label as critique of Pharisees, um, which this is another tension point of scholars. Chapter 23 is for sure a critique of the Pharisees. This is,
Hmm.
woe unto you, Pharisees. But chapter 24 seems to switch, pretty, it seems to be a pretty stark change to now focusing on the temple.
Hmm.
So to group that whole section as critique of Pharisees seems to be stretching um, a bit what that section's intended to do.
Yeah.
Um, it seems to be
And
bigger than just the Pharisees.
I think in general, the video, again, like for the sake of space and simplicity, so I understand why they did made this choice, but present they talk about Jesus's opponents as, quote, the Jewish leaders or the religious leaders. Is that the phrase they use? And that sort of lumps together these various groups that are for different reasons, I think, opposing Jesus and his message or afraid of the uprising that Jesus might be causing. Um, so yeah, in the critique of the temple, the Pharisees, we know from history, weren't primarily the ones in charge of the temple. Sadducees had much more temple power. And so it does a little bit of an injustice to the text to say that, yeah, Jesus' critique of the temple was critique, an ongoing portion of his critique of the Pharisees. Obviously, the Pharisees participated in temple worship and things like that, but I do see those as different points.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Um, another this is another structural tension. So, they're focusing on the five discourses, but what they don't have in their structure here are the three predictions of Jesus. And so this is actually where what I like about the Markan outline is that um, the Markan outline climaxes at chapter 8 in Mark and chapter 16 in Matthew with
mhm,
Peter's confession,
mhm,
right? And that's a real turning point in the book where in the Bible Project's video, this is just in the section of different expectations of the Messiah.
mhm,
Like, no, I think chapter 16, where Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ, is like the turning point, the
mhm.
expectation of the Messiah that
Yeah.
has to be reckoned with. And that tips off these Jesus now speaking directly and clearly, and he gives at different points from 16 on these really explicit, like, here's what's going to happen. We're going
Mhm.
to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to be killed and rise, just so you know. And, they didn't understand.
Right.
But like that kind of, build up to Peter's confession and then on to going then towards the mission to the death and resurrection isn't reflected as much in this five-part outline.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Um, yeah, you want to talk about the temple a bit, the clearing of the
Yeah.
temple.
Yeah, they do a good job, I think, in the video as a whole of talking about how Jesus is the Messiah, the son of David, the coming king that Israel has been awaiting and that Israel's scriptures predict. I think they're right on that Matthew presents Jesus as Israel's Messiah in terms of his fulfillment of Israel's scriptures. One point where I feel like they kind of dropped that emphasis, and I think it's really central, is in the triumphal entry, which gets very little play in this video, interestingly. But again, another kind of climactic moment that's maybe flattened by the structure they give. But Jesus rides into Zion, Jerusalem, as the fulfillment of Israel's promises, God's promises to Israel. And they also highlight this thread of the Emmanuel motif. Jesus is God with us. And I think this moment when Jesus comes into the temple, we are meant to see both themes together. So this is yes, this is Israel's king riding on a donkey in fulfillment of Zechariah. But if this is Emmanuel, this is also Yahweh returning to Jerusalem. And the reason I think that theme's worth drawing out is that where does Yahweh go? He goes to the temple. And again, if you're reading Israel's promises as background for Matthew's narrative, we know Yahweh has left the temple in Ezekiel 8, 8 through 11. The Spirit of the Lord leaves, meets with Ezekiel in exile. And the Spirit of Yahweh has not returned to the temple in Nehemiah, Ezra, even though they rebuilt the temple. And so there is this expectation in Jesus's day of Yahweh's return to Jerusalem. And so now here comes Emmanuel, this man who is God incarnate and who is Israel's king, riding into Jerusalem, being hailed as king, and he finds the temple unprepared, right? So Jesus's judgment on the temple isn't he doesn't it's not just that he doesn't like the temple as it is, or it's not just that he has problems with the people, money changers in the temple. It's that here comes Yahweh the King, and he finds the temple um yeah, unprepared for his arrival. And so that's to me that is a climactic moment of the Jewish establishment, the religious leaders misunderstanding Jesus's identity as it relates to worship. And I think that is a thematic, I mean, a climactic point in Matthew's narrative that's sort of missed by their video.
Hmm.
Even though they highlight those themes, I think they miss the this climactic
Hmm.
confrontation.
Yeah. Well, and I think in the video it says that Jesus comes to the temple and shows that he has authority over the temple.
Hmm.
Authority is a pretty weak word in terms of like what you kind of described there. It's
Yeah,
not like
yeah,
actually happening.
right. Well, yeah, and even if you're going to acknowledge that Jesus has authority over the temple, who has authority over the temple? Only Yahweh, right? I mean,
Hmm.
oh, and so they're kind of hinting maybe at it, but I think that is a huge point in Matthew's narrative.
Yeah. And I know that there's debate over like the temple clearing and what it means, whether it's destruction or whether it's I kind of
Yeah,
forget.
judgment or oh, and it might be different in different gospels. It
Okay.
could be presented in a way that has a different theological meaning. But I think, and that's why I would highlight this in Matthew. I think because we have the Emmanuel motif, because he's
Hmm.
clearly the Davidic king, that's the way I would tell the story of Matthew.
Yeah. Any other points that you want to bring up, Chris, Matthew, that we haven't covered?
I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah. I guess one last idea is what I've put here, the purpose of discipleship. So if, if we take a Mark and outline, let's just say, but clearly Matthew isn't Mark. And so why did Matthew write his? What makes Matthew distinct from Mark?
Why write another gospel if
Yeah.
assuming Matthew's second or yeah.
Yeah, where it does seem that these five discourses give the purpose of like this isn't merely just telling a story about Jesus. It is, but it's also meant to like catechize. It's meant to
Hmm.
train believers in the way of Jesus.
Hmm.
Um,
Like Torah, right? If it's like a
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and that's kind of the benefit of the five part structure is it's just not another Mark. It
Hmm.
is meant to, and I think Matthew's the most used and quoted gospel in the early church, and I think it's probably because of these five discourses that
Hmm.
lay out pretty clearly what it means to be Christian and what it means to follow Jesus, how we should now live in the church.
Hmm. Yeah, though that last point about discipleship, this is so nuanced, but they talk about how in the genealogies Jesus is presented as son of Abraham, son of David, um, new Moses. There's this so this is so nuanced, but in the genealogies, there's three sections, and the first two have this repeated phrase, and his brothers. Second one again, and his brothers. And the third one, not only is there a missing line of the genealogy is one generation shorter than it should be, but it also misses the phrase and his brothers. So the reader from the very start is asking not just who is Jesus, but who are his brothers. And this
Mhm.
gets at the purpose of discipleship. Matthew also, I think they may mention this, but Matthew also is the only gospel to use the word church. So the author clearly has this view in mind, or this community in mind, a community of Christ followers, not just individuals, but people doing it together as a gathered community. And so
Mhm.
this question of who are his brothers, it comes up again in Matthew 12. Um, they say, Your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. And Jesus replies, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. So that's Matthew 12:48. Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. And so throughout the tracing this thread from the very beginning, we have identifying Jesus as son of Abraham, son of David, knew Moses, and his disciples then as carrying on this lineage, becoming therefore sons of Abraham, members of Israel, um, part of the people of God in continuity with Israel's story.
Yeah.
So
Intentionally 12
yeah,
disciples.
exactly. That's yeah. So the purpose of discipleship then, yes, clearly catechesis and carrying on Jesus's kingdom in practical ways, and also sort of recapitulating a community drawn together by a Messiah and trusting in Yahweh in right worship, all these things that Israel was meant to be. And even there are hints that with hints within Matthew that the community of Jesus' disciples will include Gentiles, so that the promises to Abraham are being fulfilled um, as the community of God reaches out to all nations. So that the disciples are, yeah, this recapitulation of God's eternal promises to Israel. I think that's a beautiful point that
Mhm.
that is actually central to what Matthew's doing in terms of the purpose of discipleship that you get in the Great Commission, right? In that climactic, go to all nations.
Right. It's a good place to end right there. Disciple the nations.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time in the next book.